Sometimes I have to tell audiences that we're not making peace between Jews and Palestinians. That is somebody else's job. We are making peace between Jews and Christians. And of course, you might say, what? Why is that necessary? We seem to be getting along just fine. But there's a history, and I'm going to share that history this afternoon. Many Christians are shocked to learn about the history of hurt that has created this chasm of distance and mistrust between our communities. So if many Christians are shocked, most Jews are not shocked. The Jewish community has had to chronicle that history of Christian persecution against Jews and to defend itself against various parts of the Christian community for centuries. So the Jews know it well, most Christians don't. Sometimes Christians are even surprised because reading the New Testament, they think that the persecution was going the other way. And there was some of that in the New Testament, although it was actually just intra-Jewish strife, where the Jewish leaders stoned Stephen, they imprisoned Paul and beat him, and of course crucified Jesus. So these were conflicts within the Jewish community in the first century between Jews who followed Jesus and the Jewish leadership which didn't. But that direction of the persecution was very short-lived. And following that, there has been a centuries-long history of hurt going the other direction, which has created the need for a bridge. And I need my pictures of a bridge up there, Jaira. I looked and I looked and I looked. Oh, you know what? I'm looking after the PowerPoint. Oh, I apologize, Jaira. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but I am one very tired cowboy. But I'm still kicking. So, we need a bridge between our communities because of this history of hurt. So what I want to do this afternoon is, first of all, outline a little bit about Bridges for Peace's version of the bridge, what our version looks like, and then we'll go into this history of hurt that is not well known by Christians. And then I'm going to give you some examples, in addition to Bridges for Peace, of a change that has begun in the late 1800s and is ramping up now. It's still, we're calling it a remnant, but it's very real. So Bridges for Peace are Christians supporting Israel and building relationships between Christians and Jews in Israel and around the world. And we have branches in 7 countries plus Israel. We were founded by a Canadian, Dr. G. Douglas Young. He was the son of Presbyterian missionaries in North Korea, and he became quite a distinguished Bible scholar in the United States. You might have heard of Trinity Evangelical Divinity College in Deerfield, Illinois. Anybody? A couple of hands. So he was their head of Old Testament studies. And to get back to my notes here, I've talked about myself until 30 years ago being an Israel forgetful Christian. Israel was just not part of my Christian walk at all. Douglas Young was not an Israel forgetful Christian, and so in that seminary, he saw this really poignant need for young pastors to understand the place of Israel in the Bible and in God's purposes. And so the first thing he did was to organize summer courses in Israel. And following that, he organized a year-long program which was called the American Institute of Holy Land Studies. And it was in this wonderful building on Mount Zion, just across from the Sultan's Pool. It's still a college today. It's called Jerusalem College of the Bible. And so he brought American pastoral candidates to Israel to give them the idea that Israel's still part of God's program. While in Jerusalem, he and his wife, whose name was Snook, you heard that right, became friends with many Israelis. He developed a radio program where he became quite an advocate for Israel on the radio. When the Six-Day War hit, he took the school station wagon and he used it as an ambulance. And meanwhile, while he was driving his ambulance, his wife was making sandwiches for the soldiers on Mount Zion. For his work in Israel, Dr. Young was awarded the honor of Yachir Yerushalayim, worthy of Jerusalem, by the city government. So Bridges for Peace isn't here yet. This is his background in the 50s and 60s. His next step was to try to reach out to the church U.S.-wide with a newspaper. And so he founded a regular publication called the Dispatch from Jerusalem, which we still publish today. Some of you get that every second month. Recently, we published what we call the special edition, which is called Seeing Israel Through the Eyes of Faith. And it's really a primer about why Christians should care about Israel. So if you have Christian friends who could use some education, take a handful of these from our table, no cost, and give them to people that you think might be necessary. So from the beginnings of this newsletter to the American church, I don't know how it happened, but there began to be Christian volunteers in Israel who started scooping up surplus food, distributing it to the poor, providing sewing machines for needy women to support their family. And from these beginnings, 50 years ago, Bridges for Peace today feeds 24,000 needy Israelis every month, with Christian volunteers, anywhere between 40 and 60 of them, running things. These volunteers also repair the homes of the poor elderly, and we supply many, many needs in Israel, especially since the war. So we have bought many ambulances, medicycles, bloodmobiles, many bomb shelters, several security systems for Israeli communities and kibbutzes, and now we're investing a lot in trauma care, which you heard about from Shmuel this morning. All this is paid for by Christians from these 7 nations where Bridges has offices and a few Jewish supporters, and we don't turn down Jewish money. But the whole idea is for Christians to support Israel. So we're not actively marketing ourselves fundraising-wise to the Jewish community. We're just trying to build friendships. Our goal is for Christians to support Israel and bridge that chasm to build relationships between Christians and Jews in Israel and around the world. So before I get to this terrible history of Jewish-Christian relations, I'm just going to give you a picture of our ministry. There's one of the ambulances we donated, and it's in memory of Dr. G. Douglas Young. So 24,000 Israelis fed. Some of these are school children getting hot lunches. 23 towns. We just take truckloads of food, and the social workers know who the poor are in these 23 towns. 55 organizations we supply with food. 57 to Arab. We used to have about 6 Arab, but since the war, we've had less access to the Arab community. So this is our food bank, the Jerusalem Assistance Center. Our regular monthly recipients who are adopted get all kinds of fresh food and milk and meat and all kinds of things. A lot of the organizations are getting more dried goods. Oh, I know him. He was our first Canadian volunteer, I believe. And he did such a good job, they made him the National Director of Canada. Are you here, John? He's not here. Okay, everybody knows John. There's Grace. Adopt an Israeli town. That's Deanna. She's the wife of Peter Fast, our CEO. The Feed a Child program. We're in 12 schools, I think. A lot in Beit Shemesh, Jerusalem. These are some of the children. A lot of them are Ethiopian in Beit Shemesh. We focus a lot on new immigrants, and so one of our programs is Welcome Gifts, which includes blankets and pots and pans and silverware and Tanakh, other welcome gifts to get them started. Cheer baskets go to wounded soldiers, to victims of war, Holocaust survivors on their birthday. The home repair program is my favorite. Can you imagine being able to call up an agency and saying, I need my plumbing fixed, and I'd like it done for free? Well, they don't ask that way, but they find out it's free, and it's a pretty good deal. As I said, these programs are staffed by volunteers from many nations, not just the 7. We seem to get a bunch of Finland people. I don't know where. Are you here, Jonah? He'll be here tonight. His mother's here, though. All right, so why is a bridge needed? So we start out good. Entirely Jewish beginnings of the Jesus movement. Why would that be? Jesus was a Jew. So when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, so Mary and Joseph go through all the Torah requirements for a newborn. We know Jesus went to the temple and had conversations with the rabbis. And during his ministry, he always celebrated the feast. So here we have him asking the disciples to go find a place to celebrate Pesach, Passover. So entirely Jewish beginnings. And after Jesus is dead and raised and gone to heaven, the movement begins to expand. Among who does it expand? It expands among the Jews. So in Acts, we see when the day of Pentecost arrived. Now, Pentecost for you Jews is Shavuot. And so there were dwelling in Jerusalem devout men from every nation. So from the diaspora, there was already a Jewish diaspora. And these Jews, not just men, I'm sure their families were with them in many cases, came to Jerusalem to celebrate Shavuot, as they were required to do on the 3 pilgrimage festivals. And this is where the Holy Spirit was poured out with wind and fire and all of that. And 3,000 souls were baptized, and they were all Jewish. So we still have an entirely Jewish movement. But this guy, Rabbi Shaul, Paul, believes in Jesus, and he gets this calling to the non-Jews, to the Gentiles, a very specific calling. And so he goes around the Mediterranean world, starts off everywhere he goes. He preaches in the synagogue. Sometimes he's received, sometimes he's not. But then he goes out into the town square, and he preaches to the non-Jews. And many of them responded. And just as a side issue, and I don't want to take too much time, but Paul has been misconstrued as somebody who started a new religion. And he told everyone that Judaism was no good and you needed to become Christians. He did not do that. What Paul did was to tell the non-Jews that if they believed in the Messiah, that they were now connected to the God of Israel. They had been made in good relationship through the cross of Jesus with the God of Israel. He wasn't breaking things off with Judaism. So now we have thousands of non-Jews coming into the Jesus movement, and the question arises, do they need to become Jews? Because so far, everybody who's following Jesus was a Jew. So they convened a council, which in Acts 15, and the Council of Jerusalem, we call it, and the apostles debate, well, do these Gentile men have to become circumcised now that they're following Jesus? And the answer was no. In other words, the Gentiles who come into the movement don't have to become Jewish as well. And they outline a few small requirements, really, for these Gentiles who are coming into the movement so that they can have fellowship with the Jewish members of it. So it's abstaining from food offered to idols, from meat with blood, from meat that's been strangled, and from sexual immorality. And then the apostles say, and we know that you're going to hear the rest of the Torah. Moses is preached in every town, in every synagogue. So it's not that these are the only requirements when someone starts to follow Jesus. You're following the God of Israel, and the God of Israel does not like murder or adultery or covetousness or anything else that's in the Torah. So this is not the limits of the requirements, but these are just the basic entrance requirement so that there can be fellowship between Jews and Christians. Now a question arises, what about the Jews? Do they have to still keep the Torah? And so Paul comes to Jerusalem, and there's a rumor going around. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews who've been believed. They're all zealous for the law. They're good Jews. They're zealous for the law. And they've been told that you, Paul, teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. What then is to be done? And the apostles are asking this question because they know the answer. They know the answer is that the Jews are still to be Jews, even though they're now Messianic Jews. And so what do the apostles say? They say, Paul, just prove it. Prove you're still Torah observant as a Jew. Go to the temple. There are 4 young men there who've taken a vow called the Nazirite vow in Numbers 6. And you pay for the sacrifices for them to end their vow. And that will show the world that you are not telling Jewish followers to stop being Jewish. Very important, and quite lost in the church today. In the church, there's a real strong, prevalent sense that we're not to be under the law, and so when a Jew comes into the church, we'll have ham sandwiches when they get baptized, just to prove that they're no longer under the law. And this, I'm telling you, was a big mistake. So here we are. We're in the 2nd century. Jesus is in heaven. And replacement theology enters the church in this form. Origen of Alexandria was a seminary leader in Egypt, where it was the largest Jewish community in the world, as we'll see in a minute. And he writes like this: we can assert with utter confidence that the Jews will not return to their earlier situation, for they've committed the most abominable of crimes, namely crucified Jesus. So another people was called by God to the blessed election. So in other words, God is finished with the Jews because they're the murderers of Jesus, and now the church, we're going to use that term now instead of the Jesus movement, is now the chosen people. So this was theology. And theology will soon become action. But first of all, let's look at the council of the church under Constantine. You've heard that name. He made the Roman Empire Christian, and he wanted to unify the church, so he called together a council at Nicaea in Turkey. They had to debate whether Jesus was divine, or whether he was human, or whether he was divine and human. So they sorted that all out with the Nicene Creed, which we love. Most churches use it. It's not that great because it totally skips over Israel. But other than that, it's great. They get Jesus right. But the second item on the agenda of the Council of Nicaea was, when shall we celebrate Easter? Small potatoes, right? But it wasn't small potatoes, because their issue with Easter was that Jesus was crucified and raised on Passover. Obviously, the Last Supper was Passover. The next day, Jesus dies. Then he's raised 3 days later on the Feast of First Fruits. So here we are in this proudly Gentile movement, depending on the Jews for the date of Easter. And well, you think, yeah, get over it. But they didn't want to get over it. They wanted to have nothing to do with the Jews. Judaism was now the enemy of Christianity. And so Constantine presents this diatribe at the end of the Council of Nicaea, basically saying, we're not going to calculate Easter, according to Passover, we're going to do our own thing with the sun and the moon and blah, 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 but it's not going to be what the Jews do to calculate Passover, so that we have nothing to do with the murders of our Lord. So we are now de-Judaizing the church. A couple of years later, the issue of Sabbath comes up at another council in Laodicea, and the decision of that council was Christians shall not Judaize and be idle on Saturday. So to celebrate Shabbat was to be Jewish, and we don't want that. They shall work on Saturday, but the Lord's day they shall honor. As being Christians shall, if possible, do no work on that day. If, however, they are found Judaizing by not working on the Sabbath, by keeping the Sabbath, that's Judaizing, they shall be shut out from Christ. So if you keep the Sabbath as a believer in Jesus, now you're excommunicated. So this is very serious stuff. And this teaching that there was something wrong with the Jews and Judaism, even though they were the womb of this Jesus movement, just went rancid and rampant for centuries. And so this guy named John Chrysostom, when I was an Anglican, Victoria and I, we read prayers by this guy in the Anglican prayer book. He's still revered. Chrysostom, I think, is something about golden tongue or something. He was gentle and humble and admired in every way, but he had this incredible anti-Semitism. So he writes, the Jews sacrifice their children to Satan, they're worse than wild beasts, the synagogue's a brothel, on and on and on. And this is everywhere in the church. St. Augustine is one of the primary church fathers. True image of the Hebrew is Judas Iscariot, who sells the Lord for silver. The Jew can never understand the scriptures. I tell you, I listen to some Jews who really understand the scriptures, but he didn't think they could, and will forever bear the guilt for the death of Jesus. I went to a wonderful meeting recently at the Rady Center. There was about 50 pastors and rabbis. It was the Jewish Christian Coalition or something. And one of the leaders stood up and he said, the Jews did not crucify Jesus. It was the corrupt Jewish leadership in cooperation with the Romans. But that is not the message that has run through the church for centuries. It's the Jews that did it. And that's the root of all of this. Bernard of Clairvaux, you might not have heard of him. We're now into the Middle Ages. Jews are a race who had not God for their father, but were of the devil. John Calvin, we're now at 1500. The Reformation, the good guys, right? Fixing Catholicism. The Jews, rotten and unbending stiff-neckedness, deserves that they be oppressed unendingly and without measure or end, and that they die in their misery without the pity of anyone. So the Jews, we want them around, we want them to be humiliated, so everybody will see how wrong they were in crucifying Jesus and how bad they are. And the pinnacle of this is Martin Luther. The Jews got what they deserved. They've been called and elected to be God's mouth, but they kept their mouth tightly closed, their muzzles, eyes, ears, nose, whole heart. So he polluted and squirted them so full that it oozes from them in all places and devil's filth. And he gave this whole list of what you should do with the Jews. And you should burn their books and close their synagogues and don't let them be in certain professions, and on and on and on and on. And Hitler took Luther's writings and he put them into Mein Kampf. And he justified the Holocaust with the teachings of the church. So this was almost everywhere. I don't know of early church fathers who weren't anti-Semitic. Do you, Shelley? I'm sure there were some people who were just humble followers of God who didn't get caught up in this mayhem. But these words very soon led to deeds. So I mentioned Alexandria, the largest Jewish community in the world at the time. In 414, Common Era, 100,000 Jews all expelled from Alexandria. And expulsion became a norm throughout Europe for years and years and years. For example, in 1290, the Jews were all expelled from England, and we all know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue with the Jews who were expelled from Spain. And that's why Gustavo has a Spanish accent because there are many Jews in South America expelled from Spain. The laws were changed to discriminate against the Jews. The Code of Justinian in 534, Jews couldn't have certain occupations. They had all kinds of limitations, and then like Nuremberg laws, they couldn't marry Gentiles, all kinds of discriminatory laws. And these blood libels that we heard about earlier, about the matzah being made with the blood of Christian children, became commonplace through the church. And Easter became a very difficult time for the Jewish people in Christian nations. I'm going to give you some examples of how Christians treated Jews at the season of Lent and Easter. So first of all, Mardi Gras is the day before Lent, and a good activity for Mardi Gras was to take a barrel and fill it with spikes, put spikes all around it, put a Jew in it, and roll him down the hill. See how he fared. On Passover night, Jews liked to keep the door open for Elijah, but they couldn't because they were liable to get torn out of their houses and beaten up. On Good Friday in France, there was a practice called colifization. I don't know where I got that word because I Googled it recently and it's not on Google. But I got it somewhere. But what it describes is the practice of slapping a Jew on Good Friday as part of the liturgy in the church. And not just slap him, but slap him with brass knuckles, perhaps to death, as part of the liturgy of the church. So this is the experience of the Jewish people at the hands of the church. A lot of it was the Catholic Church, but it didn't stay with the Catholic Church. They weren't Catholics, so under Hitler they were Lutherans. So this is a history of hurt. And so that is why there is this need for a bridge. Because when Jews have looked at Christians historically, they have seen threat. They have seen, they are definitely not my friends. I need to stay away from them. And whatever their Jesus is all about, it's not good news for me. So that began to change, and I just made up this theory. I'll have to check it out, but I think it began to change when the Bible became translated into the vernacular. And people started to read the Bible and the prophets and to see what the Bible said about the Jewish people, and they said, something's a little off here in the church. God is not finished with the Jews. He made an eternal covenant with them. And he did exile them a few times, but he's promised to bring them back. And when the Messiah comes, they're going to be in the promised land. And so some Christians got the hang of this. And now we call them Christian Zionists. I mentioned a few last night who were involved in the Balfour Declaration in England. Lots of Christian Zionist influence in bringing the Balfour Declaration to the fore. But I want to talk about a friend of Herzl. Theodor Herzl is the founder of Zionism. By the way, I heard Bibi say recently that Christians started Zionism before the Jews. Christian Zionism is older than Jewish Zionism. So here's an example of that. There's a fellow in Germany named Reverend William Hechler, and he took an interest in Israel, or in the future of the Jews in Israel. And he showed up at Theodor Herzl's door, and he said, "God sent me." And Herzl said, "Huh?" But there was something authentic about William Hechler. He was not only a Lutheran pastor, but he was also a diplomat. And so he got Theodor Herzl into some of the courts of Europe, including the, what do they call him in Germany? Not the emperor, but the Kaiser of Germany, and tried to talk them and the Turks and others into creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Didn't succeed, but he encouraged Herzl so much that the Jerusalem Post recently wrote, "It's long been recognized that without Hechler's intercession and support, Herzl may have remained an obscure, eccentric Viennese journalist. The course of Zionism and possibly the very founding of the modern state of Israel may not have been successful." That's from the president of the Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation. Pretty good. So Hechler is now a different kind of Christian who's building a bridge to the Jewish community. I'm going to tell you the Winnipeg story. How many of you have heard my seminar on the Winnipeg connection to Israel's rebirth? Good, I'm glad, because I want to tell you fresh. So, we live on the banks of the Red River, and there's a park there. And back in the 1910s and 20s, there was a revival. For Jews, that's a tent where people preach and people get healed and they get sent out around the world to preach. That's a revival. And so out of that tent revival, down the street from our house, was formed Zion Apostolic Church. Zion Apostolic Church. It's across the river from where the tent was on Mountain or something like that. Anyway, it's in the north end. Karen, where is it? On McRae. Karen goes to that church. I don't know. I can tell you when William Hull went to Jerusalem. But so out of that church, they sent people all around the world to preach the gospel. And one of the people they sent out was Reverend William Hull, who was the manager of the silk department in Eaton's, but a faithful listener to the message of Zion Apostolic Church. And so he moved to Jerusalem in 1935 after hearing the call of God at Zion Apostolic Church, and he established a Bible bookstore, 1935. His wife's name was, I forget. You can find out her name in his book, The Fall and Rise of Israel. Not the rise and fall like Rome, but the fall and, sorry, did I say that right? Not the rise and fall like Rome, but the fall and rise like Israel. And he wrote this book, and he's got about 20 pages about the story I'm going to tell you now. So he's there from 1935, and in 1947, UNSCOP comes to town. We mentioned them last night, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. Canada is one of the 14 countries represented, and our representative is Judge Ivan Rand from the Supreme Court, actually an anti-Semite, believe it or not. He was also very famous for putting in some very special labor legislation, which is still called the Rand Formula. So this committee aren't doing any better than the British in figuring out how to solve the Jewish-Arab conflict. So Judge Ivan Rand decides he's going to find in Jerusalem a Canadian who knows something about the situation. And of course, he finds William Hull, our silk department manager, who's now in Jerusalem running a Bible bookstore. So they have lunch, and in one lunch, Hull turns Rand into a Zionist. He describes what the Jews are doing to the land and how they must have a part of the land. And at that point, there was never the option of giving the Jews all of Palestine. It was just too far gone at that point, which is, I think, what the Jews were given by the Balfour Declaration in San Remo. But at this point, partition was the best that could be done. And so Rand went back to UNSCOP with his new Zionism from William Hull, and he convinced them that there should be a partition, like the Peel partition wasn't accepted. And so the committee accepted it. They proposed it to the General Assembly. The General Assembly approved it. The United States validated it in 11 minutes or something like that. And here we have today the State of Israel, partly because of a Christian Zionist from Zion Apostolic Church in Winnipeg. Is that wonderful? Or what? So there's Zion, if you want to go check them out. There's just a little remnant there left, but they still have an Israeli flag in the sanctuary. So God is doing something new. He allowed this terrible anti-Semitism to infect the church for centuries. We'll ask him what that was about when we get there. But something new has been happening since the late 1800s, and Christians are understanding that God has not broken his covenant with the Jewish people and that we are grafted in, we're not replacing, and we need to support the Jews wherever they are around the world, including in their aliyah to Israel. So I think I'll just leave it there. I just gave you these 3 slides right now. What the church needs to understand is, as Jeremiah said, God has loved the Jews with an everlasting love, and as long as the sun and the moon are in the sky, he's not breaking his covenant with them. The church has not replaced Israel, but the church has been grafted into Israel. We're not Jewish, but we are grafted in. We're part of the Commonwealth of Israel. And finally, God is bringing the Jews back to Israel from the north, from the south, from the east and the west. Then shall the young women rejoice in the dance, and the young men and the old men shall be merry. I will turn their mourning into joy. Jeremiah 31. If you want to read my mini Bible about Israel and Christians, read Jeremiah 31, read Romans 11, and read Ezekiel 36. Behold, branches of Israel on the mountains of Israel, bring forth fruit, for my people shall soon come home. Once again, Jeremiah 31, Romans 11, and Ezekiel 36. So that, my friends, is why there's a bridge necessary, and it may have been news to some of you and not to others, but I think it's important that both Jews and Christians understand the big picture, what's been going on over these last 2 millennia between us. Thank you.